In August of 480 BC, a Spartan king named Leonidas stood at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae with just 300 of his finest warriors, watching as the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen approached like a dark tide across the Malian Gulf. The Persian Empire, stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean Sea, had come to swallow Greece whole. What happened over the next 3 days would echo through 25 centuries of human history, transforming a military defeat into the most celebrated last stand ever recorded. The man who would become legend was born around 540 BC into Sparta's royal Agiad dynasty, a bloodline that claimed descent from the mythical hero Heracles himself. Leonidas, whose name meant descendant of Leon, was the third son of King Anaxandridas II, making him an unlikely candidate for the throne. In most Greek city-states, a prince so far from succession would have been groomed for court life, but Sparta was unlike any other place in the ancient world. Because he was not the immediate heir, young Leonidas was enrolled in the agoge, Sparta's brutal, state-mandated education system that transformed boys into the deadliest warriors Greece had ever produced. From the age of 7, Leonidas was torn from his family and thrust into a world of relentless physical training, survival exercises, and combat drills. The agoge was designed to break the weak and forge the strong into living weapons. Boys slept on beds of reeds they gathered themselves, wore a single cloak year-round regardless of weather, and were deliberately underfed to encourage resourcefulness. They fought each other daily, learned to endure pain without complaint, and were taught that death in battle was the highest honor a Spartan could achieve. For 2 decades, Leonidas endured this crucible, emerging as one of Sparta's elite warriors, never imagining that fate would place a crown upon his head. His path to kingship came through tragedy and mystery. His older half-brother, Cleomenes I, who had ruled Sparta since their father's death around 524 BC, died under suspicious circumstances in 490 BC, reportedly taking his own life in prison after being declared insane. Another brother, Dorieus, had already perished in Sicily years earlier while attempting to establish a colony. Suddenly, the warrior who had been trained to die for Sparta found himself destined to lead it. Leonidas married Gorgo, his niece and Cleomenes' daughter, and assumed the throne at approximately 50 years of age, bringing with him not the soft hands of a courtier, but the scarred flesh and iron discipline of a soldier who had spent his entire life preparing for war. The storm that would define Leonidas's legacy had been gathering for decades. In 499 BC, Greek cities in Ionia had rebelled against Persian rule, receiving support from Athens and Eretria. The revolt failed, but it sparked a chain of events that would bring the might of Persia crashing down upon Greece. Darius I, the Persian king, launched the first invasion in 490 BC, only to see his forces stunned by defeat at Marathon, where 10,000 Athenians crushed an army more than twice their size. The humiliation burned in Persian memory, and when Xerxes I ascended to the throne in 486 BC, he began preparations for an invasion that would dwarf his father's attempt. For 4 years, Xerxes marshaled the resources of an empire spanning 3 continents. Ancient historians like Herodotus claimed the Persian army numbered in the millions, with 5,283,220 men, though modern scholars believe the true figure was between 120,000 and 300,000 soldiers. Even at the lower estimate, it was a force of unprecedented scale. Xerxes ordered the construction of 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, each over a mile long, built from hundreds of ships lashed together with cables of flax and papyrus. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, the furious king ordered the engineers beheaded and commanded his men to whip the waters 300 times, while denouncing the sea as a turbid and briny river. In the spring of 480 BC, this massive host began its march westward. The Persian army was a terrifying spectacle of diversity and power. At its heart marched the 10,000 Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, so named because their number was immediately replaced when any fell in battle. They wore scaled armor that glittered like serpent skin, carried wicker shields, and fought with spears, swords, and powerful composite bows. Behind them came contingents from every corner of the empire. Medes in their leather armor and cylindrical caps, Assyrians with bronze helmets and wooden clubs studded with iron, Bactrians with their short spears and composite bows, Indians dressed in cotton and armed with bamboo bows shooting iron-tipped arrows, and dozens of other nations, each bringing their own weapons and ways of war. The Greeks, divided as always into quarreling city-states, initially struggled to mount a unified defense. At the Congress of Corinth, representatives from the various cities agreed to resist, but their first attempt to stop the Persians at the Vale of Tempe collapsed when they realized the position could be easily outflanked. As Xerxes' army crossed the Hellespont and began its inexorable march south, the allied Greeks faced a critical decision. The Athenian general Themistocles proposed a desperate strategy: hold the narrow coastal pass at Thermopylae while the Greek fleet blocked the straits at Artemisium. If they could delay the Persians long enough, perhaps they could find a way to defeat this seemingly invincible force. Thermopylae, meaning hot gates, after the sulfur springs that bubbled near the pass, was a geographic anomaly that offered Greece its only hope. Here, the mountains pressed so close to the sea that the coastal road narrowed to a passage just 12 to 30 meters wide at its narrowest point. It was the only route by which Xerxes' massive army could march into central Greece without dividing his forces. An old Phocian wall, built generations earlier, provided additional defensive advantages. Yet this strategic position came with a fatal flaw. Local inhabitants knew of a mountain path called the Anapaea that wound through the hills and emerged behind the Greek position. When the call came for Sparta to send its army north, the city faced a religious crisis. The Carneia, a sacred festival to Apollo, was underway, and Spartan law forbade military campaigns during religious observances. The Olympic Games were also approaching, another sacred time when warfare was forbidden. Yet the threat was too grave to ignore completely. As a compromise, King Leonidas would lead a small advance guard of 300 Spartan warriors, all men with living sons to carry on their bloodlines, to hold the pass until the festivals ended and the full army could march. Each warrior selected understood this might be a one-way mission. As Leonidas marched north, his force grew. 700 Thespians joined him, along with 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and contingents from Tegea, Mantinea, Arcadia, Corinth, and other cities. By the time they reached Thermopylae, the Greek force numbered approximately 7,000 men, though exact figures remain debated. Leonidas positioned his main force at the narrowest section of the pass and stationed 1,000 Phocians on the heights to guard the treacherous Anapaea path. Then they waited. The oracle at Delphi had spoken dark words to the Spartans before Leonidas departed. Either Sparta would be destroyed, or it would lose a king descended from Heracles. Leonidas surely knew these words as he watched the Persian host approach in late August. For 4 days, Xerxes camped within sight of the pass, perhaps hoping the tiny Greek force would flee at the sight of his vast army. When a Persian scout rode close to observe the Greek position, he reported back to Xerxes that the Spartans were exercising naked and combing their long hair. The Persian king laughed at this seemingly absurd behavior, until Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king in his service, explained that this was how Spartans prepared for battle when they expected to die. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ended. He sent an envoy to Leonidas with a simple demand: surrender your weapons. The Spartan king's response became immortal in its laconic brevity. Molon labe, come and take them. These two words, carved later in stone and echoed through history, encapsulated the Spartan ethos of defiance against overwhelming odds. They were not merely rejecting surrender, they were inviting their own destruction rather than submit to foreign domination. When negotiations failed, Xerxes ordered his Median and Kissian troops forward, expecting to sweep aside the small Greek force in hours. What followed instead was a masterclass in defensive warfare that would be studied in military academies for millennia to come. The Greeks, led by the Spartans, formed a phalanx at the narrowest point of the pass. Their bronze-faced hoplon shields, each nearly a meter in diameter, overlapped to create an impenetrable wall. Behind each shield thrust deadly spears nearly 3 meters long, creating a forest of bronze points that no Persian soldier could penetrate. The Persians, accustomed to fighting in open terrain where their mobility and archery could dominate, found themselves funneled into a killing field. Their wicker shields offered little protection against Greek bronze spear points, and their shorter weapons couldn't reach past the wall of Greek shields. Wave after wave of Persian troops crashed against the Greek line like water against stone, each assault leaving hundreds of Persian dead piled before the defenders. The Greeks, meanwhile, rotated fresh troops to the front lines, maintaining their defensive wall while exhausted warriors recovered behind the phalanx. Frustrated by the mounting casualties, Xerxes deployed his elite force, the 10,000 Immortals, expecting these professional soldiers to shatter the Greek defense. But even the Immortals, despite their reputation and superior equipment, could not overcome the tactical advantages the Greeks enjoyed. The Spartans employed a devastating, feigned retreat, suddenly turning and running as if fleeing in panic. When the pursuing Persians broke formation to give chase, the Spartans wheeled around in perfect unison and slaughtered their disorganized enemies. This maneuver, requiring extraordinary discipline and coordination, could only be executed by warriors who had trained together since childhood. By nightfall of the first day, Persian bodies carpeted the approach to the pass, and Xerxes had made no progress. The second day brought more of the same carnage. Xerxes threw his forces against the Greek line with increasing desperation, rotating different national contingents to maintain pressure, but the narrow confines of Thermopylae continued to neutralize his numerical advantage. The Greeks held firm, their bronze armor deflecting Persian arrows, while their disciplined phalanx formations cut down anyone who ventured within spear range. Herodotus records that Xerxes, watching from his golden throne positioned on a nearby hill, leapt up 3 times in terror for his army as he witnessed the slaughter. The supposedly invincible Persian military machine was being humiliated by a force less than 1/20th its size. Then came the betrayal that would echo through history with infamy. As darkness fell on the second day, a local Greek named Ephialtes of Trachis approached the Persian camp. Motivated by greed and the promise of reward from Xerxes, this man, whose name would become synonymous with nightmare in Greek, revealed the existence of the Anapeia path. This mountain trail, known to locals but hidden from outsiders, wound through the hills and emerged behind the Greek position. For the 30 pieces of silver that never came, Ephialtes had signed the death warrant of Leonidas and his men. That night, Xerxes sent his Immortals, led by their commander Hydarnes and guided by the traitor, along the moonlit mountain path. The Phocian troops guarding the Anapeia path were caught completely by surprise when they heard the rustling of oak leaves under thousands of Persian feet at dawn of the third day. They hastily armed themselves and retreated to higher ground, expecting to make a stand. But the Persians had no interest in engaging them. The Immortals simply loosed a volley of arrows to keep the Phocians pinned down, then continued their march to encircle the main Greek force. A runner brought the devastating news to Leonidas. The position was compromised, and the Persians would soon attack from both front and rear. Leonidas called a council of war as the sun rose on what would be his last day. The situation was hopeless, and he knew it. The majority of the Greek force could still escape if they left immediately, but someone would need to hold the pass to cover their retreat. The prophecy from Delphi must have weighed heavily on his mind. Either Sparta would fall, or a king of Heracles' line would die. Leonidas made his choice. He dismissed the allied contingents, ordering them to retreat and live to fight another day. The Thespians, 700 strong, refused to leave, choosing to die alongside the Spartans rather than abandon their posts. The 400 Thebans remained as well, though historians debate whether they stayed voluntarily or were held as hostages. As the morning sun climbed higher, Leonidas led his remaining force of approximately 1,400 men out from behind the wall for a final assault. They knew they would die, but they were determined to sell their lives dearly. The fighting that followed was the most savage of the entire battle. The Greeks, fighting with the fury of men who knew death was certain, carved through the Persian ranks with terrible efficiency. Leonidas himself fell early in this final phase, and a desperate struggle erupted over his body. 4 times the Persians seized it, and 4 times the Greeks drove them back, determined that their king's corpse would not be dishonored. When their spears shattered from overuse, the Greeks fought with swords. When their swords broke, they used their fists and teeth. 2 of Xerxes' own brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes, died in the melee. The Persians, despite their overwhelming numbers, were forced to use whips to drive their own troops forward into the grinding slaughter. Finally, with the Immortals closing from behind and fresh Persian forces pressing from the front, the surviving Greeks made their last stand on a small hill behind the wall. They formed a circle, facing outward, and fought until Persian arrows darkened the sky and ended their resistance. The aftermath was as brutal as the battle itself. Xerxes, abandoning Persian customs that honored brave enemies, ordered Leonidas's head severed and his body crucified, an act of desecration that shocked even his own officers. The king tried to hide the extent of his losses, reportedly burying most of his dead secretly, while displaying the Greek corpses to his army. Modern historians estimate Persian casualties at 20,000 or more, a staggering price for a 3-day battle against such a small force. Among the Greek dead lay every single Spartan, all 700 Thespians, and most of the Thebans, though some Thebans survived by surrendering and were later branded with the Persian king's mark as slaves. Yet in this defeat lay the seeds of ultimate Greek victory. The 3 days Leonidas bought with his life proved invaluable. Athens completed its evacuation, moving its population to the island of Salamis and preparing its fleet for the naval battle that would determine Greece's fate. The story of the 300 spread like wildfire through the Greek world, transforming a military disaster into a rallying cry for resistance. When Xerxes reached Athens, he found it empty, denying him the satisfaction of capturing Greece's intellectual heart intact. More importantly, the battle had revealed the Persian army's critical weakness. In confined spaces where numbers meant nothing, Greek hoplites were virtually unbeatable. 1 month later, in the narrow straits of Salamis, the Greek navy, inspired by the sacrifice at Thermopylae and led by the brilliant Athenian strategist Themistocles, destroyed the Persian fleet. Xerxes, fearing he might be trapped in Greece if the Greeks destroyed his pontoon bridges, fled back to Asia with much of his army, leaving his general Mardonius with a still formidable force to complete the conquest. But the spell of Persian invincibility was broken. The following year, at Plataea, the largest hoplite army ever assembled crushed Mardonius and his forces, while on the same day, according to tradition, another Greek force destroyed the remnants of the Persian fleet at Mycale. The implications of these victories extended far beyond military triumph. Had Xerxes succeeded in conquering Greece, the democratic experiments of Athens would have been strangled in their infancy. The philosophical traditions that would produce Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle would never have flourished under Persian rule. The artistic and architectural innovations that defined classical Greece would have been stillborn. The concept of citizen soldiers fighting for their own freedom, rather than at the command of a divine king, would have perished at Thermopylae. Instead, these ideas survived and spread, eventually forming the bedrock of Western civilization. The last stand at Thermopylae became more than history. It transformed into myth, a story that transcended its tactical significance to become a timeless symbol of courage against tyranny. The epitaph composed by the poet Simonides, carved in stone at the site, captured this transformation in its elegant simplicity. Stranger, go tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their orders. For 2,500 years, whenever free people have stood against overwhelming odds, whenever soldiers have chosen death over dishonor, whenever the few have defended the many, the ghosts of Thermopylae have stood with them. Today, the geography of Thermopylae has changed beyond recognition. Silt deposits from the Spercheios River have pushed the coastline several kilometers from where it stood in 480 BC, and the narrow pass where Leonidas made his stand now lies beneath 20 meters of earth. A modern highway runs through what was once the killing field, but the legacy endures. Military academies still study the tactical lessons of the battle. The phrase "molon labe" remains the motto of Greek military units and has been adopted by freedom fighters worldwide. Movies, books, and countless retellings keep the story alive for each new generation. Perhaps most significantly, Thermopylae established a template for how Western civilization would view itself in relation to external threats. The battle created a narrative of outnumbered defenders of freedom standing against Eastern despotism, a story that would be invoked during the Crusades, the Ottoman invasions of Europe, and even in modern conflicts. While historians today recognize the oversimplification in such East-West dichotomies, the psychological impact of Thermopylae on European consciousness cannot be overstated. King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans did not merely buy 3 days for Greece. They purchased centuries of European independence and cultural development with their blood. In choosing death over submission, they created an immortal example that continues to inspire those who value freedom over life itself. Their last stand at the hot gates proved that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, and that a king's duty to his people can extend beyond life into legend. In those 3 days in August of 480 BC, one king's sacrifice truly bought Europe its freedom.